I never thought a simple dinner plate could shatter my entire world. But that Sunday evening at my in-laws' house, when my father-in-law, Frank Miller, suddenly knocked that antique dish right out of my hands, everything I believed about my new family crumbled with it. "Why did you do that?" my husband David asked, his voice sharp with confusion. But it was my mother-in-law Sarah's reaction that made my blood run cold. She turned completely pale, like she'd seen a ghost, and started frantically cleaning up the pieces before I could even process what had happened. The terrible truth was hiding in those broken fragments, and I was about to discover that some family secrets are worth killing for. Let me back up. My name is Amanda Thompson, and 6 months ago, I thought I'd married into the perfect American family. The Millers seemed like something straight out of a Norman Rockwell painting. Successful, respected, with their beautiful colonial house and Sunday dinner traditions that went back 3 generations. David had swept me off my feet with his charm and devotion. He was everything I thought I wanted: stable, loving, from a good family. When he proposed after just 8 months of dating, I said yes without hesitation. Maybe I should have asked more questions. Maybe I should have paid attention to the little things that didn't quite add up. But love makes you blind, doesn't it? Have you ever been so caught up in the fairy tale that you missed all the red flags? That Sunday started like any other. Sarah had insisted I help serve dinner using her grandmother's china, the same plates that had been passed down through 4 generations of Miller women. "Someday these will be yours, dear," she'd said with that tight smile I was still learning to read. I remember thinking how beautiful they were, those delicate porcelain dishes with their intricate blue and white patterns. I held each one carefully, like I was carrying something sacred, because in a way, I was. I was carrying the weight of family tradition, of belonging, of finally having a place where I fit. Frank Miller sat at the head of the table, the way he always did. Distinguished, silver-haired, the kind of man who commanded respect without saying much. He'd built a successful construction business from nothing, David always said, a real American success story. But there was something about the way Frank looked at me that always made me feel like I was being studied under a microscope. Have you ever felt like someone was seeing right through you, like they knew something you didn't? As I served the roast beef, I tried to make conversation. "The weather's been lovely, hasn't it?" Small talk, the kind that fills awkward silences. Sarah nodded politely. David squeezed my hand under the table. Everything seemed normal. But Frank kept watching me with those pale blue eyes, and when I reached across to set down his plate, something shifted in his expression. It was subtle. Just a tightening around his eyes, a slight change in the way he held his mouth, like he'd made a decision about something. "Careful with those plates, Amanda," Sarah said, though I wasn't being careless at all. "They're irreplaceable." I nodded, concentrating on not making any mistakes. These people had accepted me into their family. The least I could do was handle their heirlooms with respect. But as I turned from the sideboard, balancing Sarah's plate in both hands, Frank suddenly stood up. What happened next lasted maybe 3 seconds, but it felt like slow motion. Frank's hand shot out, fast and deliberate, and struck the plate right out of my grip. The crash was deafening in the quiet dining room, china exploding against hardwood, pieces scattering everywhere. "Oh my God," I gasped, dropping to my knees instinctively to gather the fragments. "I'm so sorry, I don't know how—" "Why did you do that?" David's voice cut through my apologies, sharp and bewildered. He was staring at his father like he'd never seen him before. That's when I looked up and saw Sarah's face. All the color had drained from her cheeks, and her hands were shaking as she pressed them against her mouth. This wasn't the reaction of a woman upset about broken china. This was pure, undiluted terror. "It was an accident," Frank said gruffly, but his eyes never left mine. Clumsy of me. But I knew it wasn't an accident. The way he'd moved, the precision of it. Frank Miller had knocked that plate out of my hands on purpose. The question was why? As I knelt there among the broken pieces, something caught my eye. The plate hadn't just shattered. It had broken cleanly in places, revealing something I'd never noticed before. The antique china wasn't solid. There was a hollow space inside and something had fallen out. A folded piece of paper, yellowed with age. I palmed it quickly, my heart hammering as I pretended to collect shards. Sarah was moving now, frantically sweeping up pieces with a dustpan, her movements jerky and panicked. "Leave it," Frank commanded. "I'll clean it up later." But Sarah kept sweeping, kept gathering, like she was searching for something specific among the fragments. When she realized the paper was gone, her eyes met mine across the scattered china, and I saw fear there. Real, bone-deep fear. "I should go," I said quietly, standing up with my hands full of porcelain pieces. "I've caused enough trouble." David started to protest, but I was already moving toward the kitchen, my pulse racing. In the privacy of the hallway, I unfolded the paper with trembling fingers. What I read there made my blood freeze in my veins. It was a newspaper clipping, dated 23 years ago. The headline read, "Local girl still missing after 2 weeks." Below it was a photo of a young woman with dark hair and bright eyes. She looked almost exactly like me. The article was brief but chilling. Jennifer Walsh, age 19, had disappeared from a construction site owned by Miller Development. No trace had ever been found. Police suspected foul play, but no arrests were ever made. The case had gone cold. At the bottom of the clipping, someone had written in faded ink, "She knew too much. FM. FM. Frank Miller." I stood in that hallway, legs shaking as the pieces started falling into place. The way Frank watched me. Sarah's nervous behavior whenever I asked about family history. The strange reluctance to show me old photo albums or talk about the past. And the most terrifying realization of all, I looked exactly like Jennifer Walsh. Have you ever had that moment when everything you thought you knew turns out to be a lie? I heard footsteps approaching and quickly shoved the clipping into my pocket. David appeared around the corner, his face creased with concern. "Are you okay?" "I don't know what got into Dad. He's been acting strange all evening." I wanted to tell him. God, how I wanted to grab his shoulders and show him what I'd found, to make him understand that his father might be a killer. But the words stuck in my throat. Because if Frank Miller had murdered Jennifer Walsh, what would he do to me now that I knew? "I'm fine," I managed to say, "just embarrassed about the plate." David pulled me into his arms, and for a moment I let myself feel safe. This was my husband, the man I loved. Surely he couldn't be part of whatever dark secret his family was hiding. But as he held me, I couldn't stop thinking about that newspaper clipping, about a young woman who disappeared without a trace, about the fact that Frank Miller had deliberately smashed that plate to prevent me from discovering what was hidden inside. The terrible truth was starting to surface, and I was beginning to realize that my fairy tale marriage might actually be a nightmare. "We should go home," I whispered against David's chest. He nodded, stroking my hair. "Yeah, let me just say goodbye to Mom and Dad." As he walked back toward the dining room, I pulled out my phone and quickly photographed the newspaper clipping. Whatever was happening here, whatever the Millers were hiding, I was going to find out. Jennifer Walsh deserved that much, but I had no idea that by taking that photo, I'd just signed my own death warrant. The drive home was quiet. David kept glancing at me, clearly troubled by the evening's events, but I couldn't bring myself to tell him what I'd discovered. Not yet. Not until I understood what it meant. "Dad's been under a lot of stress lately," David said finally. "The business isn't doing as well as it used to. Maybe that's why he's been acting weird." I nodded absently, my mind racing. If Frank Miller had killed Jennifer Walsh 23 years ago, why keep a newspaper clipping as evidence? Unless it wasn't evidence of guilt, unless it was a trophy. The thought made me sick. Back home in our little apartment, I waited until David fell asleep before pulling out my laptop. I needed to know everything about Jennifer Walsh, about what had happened to her, about why Frank Miller might have wanted her dead. The internet search results painted a grim picture. Jennifer had been a journalism student doing a summer internship with the local newspaper. She'd been investigating safety violations at construction sites around town. The last story she'd filed was about Miller Development cutting corners on a low-income housing project. 3 days later, she vanished. I found more articles, more details. Jennifer's car had been found abandoned near the construction site. Her purse was still inside, money and credit cards untouched. She'd simply disappeared, like she'd never existed at all. The police had questioned Frank Miller, of course. He'd claimed Jennifer never showed up for their scheduled interview. No evidence contradicted his story. The case went cold, and eventually, people stopped talking about the girl who'd asked too many questions. But someone had kept that newspaper clipping. Someone had hidden it inside a family heirloom, like a secret that couldn't be thrown away, but was too dangerous to display. I stared at Jennifer's photo on my screen, at the bright smile and determined eyes. She'd been trying to expose the truth, and it had gotten her killed. Now here I was, 23 years later, married into the very family she'd been investigating. Was it coincidence that I looked so much like her? Or had David chosen me for that very reason? The thought hit me like a physical blow. What if my husband hadn't fallen in love with me at all? What if he'd selected me because I resembled his father's victim? What kind of sick game were the Millers playing? I closed the laptop and sat in the dark, listening to David's steady breathing. Tomorrow, I would have to pretend everything was normal. I'd have to smile and act like the loving wife while I figured out what to do with this terrible knowledge. But I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't going to end up like Jennifer Walsh. I wasn't going to disappear without a trace. If the Millers thought they could silence me the way they'd silenced her, they were about to learn a very painful lesson. Because unlike Jennifer, I wasn't just a journalism student asking inconvenient questions. I was something much more dangerous. I was a woman with nothing left to lose, and I was going to make them pay for every lie they'd ever told. The terrible truth was just beginning to unfold, and this time, the victim was going to fight back. The next morning, I made the most important decision of my life. I wasn't going to run, and I wasn't going to hide. I was going to do what Jennifer Walsh never got the chance to finish. I was going to expose the truth about Frank Miller, no matter what it cost me. What David didn't know, what none of the Millers knew, was that I wasn't just some naive young woman who'd stumbled into their family by accident. I was Amanda Thompson, licensed private investigator, and I'd been hunting Frank Miller for 3 years. You see, Jennifer Walsh wasn't just some random victim I'd read about online. She was my sister. I know what you're thinking. How could I marry into the family of my sister's killer? The answer is simple. It was the only way to get close enough to find the evidence that would finally bring him down. The resemblance between Jennifer and me wasn't coincidence. We were twins, separated when our parents divorced. She'd taken our father's name, Walsh. I'd kept our mother's name, Thompson. When Jennifer disappeared, I was away at college in California. By the time I got back, the trail was already cold. The police had given up. Our father had drunk himself to death within 2 years, and our mother never recovered from losing both her daughters. One to murder, one to obsession with revenge. I'd spent the last 5 years of my life learning everything I could about investigation, about gathering evidence, about building cases that would hold up in court. And then I'd spent 3 more years carefully constructing the perfect cover identity to get close to the Miller family. Meeting David hadn't been an accident. I'd researched his habits, his favorite coffee shop, his jogging route. I'd engineered our chance encounter with the precision of a military operation. Even falling in love with him had been part of the plan, at least at first. But here's the thing about long-term undercover work. Sometimes the lies start feeling more real than the truth. Sometimes you forget where the performance ends and you begin. I'd planned to use David Miller to get to his father. What I hadn't planned was actually caring about him. Did that make me a monster? Maybe. But watching my twin sister's killer live free for 23 years while her murderer built a fortune and a reputation as a pillar of the community, that had made me something worse than a monster. It had made me desperate, and desperate people do desperate things. I waited until David left for work before I made my first call. Agent Rebecca Torres of the FBI had been tracking cold cases involving missing persons and construction companies for the past 5 years. She'd been waiting for someone with inside access to the Miller family for almost as long as I'd been planning this operation. "It's time," I said when she answered. "I found evidence." "What kind of evidence?" I told her about the newspaper clipping, about the hollow plate, about Frank's reaction when he realized what I'd discovered. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Amanda, you know this changes everything. Once we move forward, there's no going back. Your marriage, your entire life as Amanda Miller, it's all going to disappear." I looked around the apartment I'd shared with David for 6 months, at the photos on the mantle showing our wedding day, our honeymoon, all the moments when I'd almost forgotten this was just an elaborate lie. The hardest part wasn't that I'd have to give up this life. The hardest part was that I'd actually grown to love it. "Jennifer deserves justice," I said quietly. "That's more important than my feelings." "What about David? Do you think he knows?" That was the question that had been eating at me all night. Was my husband innocent in his father's crimes, or was he part of the conspiracy? Had his love for me been real, or was I just another pawn in some sick family game? "I don't know," I admitted, "but I'm going to find out." After I hung up with Rebecca, I did something that went against every instinct I'd developed as an investigator. I decided to trust David with a piece of the truth. Not all of it, not yet, but enough to gauge his reaction. He came home that evening with flowers and an apology for his father's behavior. We sat down to dinner, and I watched his face carefully as I spoke. "David, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." He set down his fork, immediately alert. "Of course. What is it? Has your father ever mentioned a girl named Jennifer Walsh?" The change in his expression was instant and devastating. The color drained from his face and his hands started shaking. But it wasn't the reaction of someone who'd been caught in a lie. It was the reaction of someone who'd just had their worst fears confirmed. "How do you know that name?" he whispered. "Answer my question first. Has he mentioned her?" David closed his eyes and was quiet for a long moment. When he opened them again, I saw something I'd never seen before. Genuine fear. "Yes," he said finally, "but not the way you think." He got up and walked to the window, staring out at the street like he was afraid someone might be watching. I was 7 years old when Jennifer Walsh disappeared. I remember because it was the summer everything changed in our house. Changed how? Dad started having nightmares. He'd wake up screaming, covered in sweat, talking about blood on his hands. Mom would calm him down, but I could hear them fighting about it, about her, about what he'd done. My heart was pounding. "What did he do, David?" He turned to face me, and I saw tears in his eyes. "I think he killed her, Amanda. I think my father is a murderer, and I've been living with that knowledge for 23 years. The confession hit me like a physical blow. All this time, David had known. He'd suspected his father was capable of murder, and he'd said nothing, done nothing. "Why didn't you go to the police?" I asked, trying to keep the accusation out of my voice. "With what?" "The nightmares of a 7-year-old. I had no proof, just suspicions and childhood memories that might not even be real." He sat back down, reaching for my hands. "But when I saw how Dad reacted to you last night, when he deliberately broke that plate, Amanda, I think he's figured out that you look like her." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I think we're both in danger." I stared at my husband, this man I'd planned to betray, who had just revealed that he'd been carrying the same terrible knowledge I had, but from the opposite side. He thought he was protecting me from his father's dark secret. I was gathering evidence to destroy his entire family. The irony was almost too much to bear. "David," I said carefully, "what if I told you there was a way to make sure he could never hurt anyone again?" His grip on my hands tightened. "What do you mean?" "I mean, what if we could find proof, real proof that would put him away forever?" For a moment, hope flickered in his eyes. Then it died, replaced by resignation. "He's too smart, Amanda. If there was evidence, it would have been found years ago. He's covered his tracks too well." That's when I made my second life-changing decision of the day. I was going to tell David the truth, not all of it, but enough to make him my ally instead of my unwitting victim. "There's something I need to show you," I said, reaching for my purse. "But first, I need you to promise me that no matter what, you won't go to your parents about this." He nodded, confused but trusting. I pulled out the newspaper clipping and placed it on the table between us. David's face went white as he read it, and when he looked up at me, there was something new in his expression. Understanding, maybe, or recognition. "Where did you find this?" "Inside the plate your father broke. It was hidden in a hollow space in the china." David stared at the clipping for a long time, his jaw working silently. Finally, he looked up at me with eyes full of pain and determination. "What do we do?" "We finish what Jennifer Walsh started," I said. "We bring him down." What I didn't tell David was that I'd already set the wheels in motion. What I didn't tell him was that FBI agents were already building a case based on information I'd been feeding them for months. What I didn't tell him was that his father wasn't just going to be arrested, he was going to be destroyed. And what I definitely didn't tell him was that I was Jennifer Walsh's twin sister, and I'd been planning this revenge for 8 years. Some truths are too dangerous to share, even with the people you love. Over the next 3 days, David and I worked together to search for evidence. He helped me access family documents, old business records, anything that might connect Frank Miller to Jennifer's disappearance. We found discrepancies in construction schedules, payments to workers who didn't exist, gaps in the timeline that suggested a cover-up. But the real breakthrough came when David remembered something from his childhood, a storage unit his father rented across town, one that no one in the family was supposed to know about. He used to go there late at night, David told me as we sat in my car outside the facility, when he thought everyone was asleep. I followed him once when I was 12. He caught me and, let's just say, I never tried it again. Getting into the storage unit required skills David didn't know I had. Lockpicking wasn't something most wives learned in their spare time, but it was second nature to someone who'd spent years preparing for this moment. Inside, we found Frank Miller's real legacy, boxes of documents detailing bribes paid to city inspectors, safety reports that had been buried, evidence of corner cutting that had resulted in several accidents over the years. And in a fireproof safe at the back of the unit, we found the smoking gun, Jennifer's camera. It was an old 35mm, the kind journalism students used in the 1990s. The film inside had been developed long ago, but Frank had kept the negatives. Photo after photo of safety violations at Miller development sites, pictures of substandard materials being used in construction, evidence that would have destroyed Frank's business and probably sent him to prison, evidence that had cost my sister her life. But there was something else in that safe, something that made my blood run cold and changed everything I thought I knew about the Miller family. A birth certificate, not for David or any other family member I knew about. A birth certificate for Jennifer Walsh Miller, dated 6 months before Jennifer's disappearance. Frank Miller hadn't just killed my sister. He'd married her first. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. Jennifer hadn't been some random journalist investigating a story. She'd been Frank's secret wife, probably pregnant with his child, probably threatening to expose him when she found out about his illegal activities. "David," I whispered, showing him the document, "did you know your father was married before he met your mother?" David stared at the certificate with the same shock I was feeling. "That's impossible. He and Mom have been together since high school. They got married right after graduation. But the dates didn't lie. Frank Miller had been living a double life 23 years ago, married to both Sarah and Jennifer at the same time. When Jennifer threatened to expose him, he'd killed her and buried the evidence. All except for one newspaper clipping, hidden away like a twisted memento in his wife's family china. "We have to call the police," David said, his voice shaking. I nodded, but I was already reaching for my phone to call Agent Torres instead. This was bigger than a local police matter now. This was federal. "Rebecca," I said when she answered, "we found it, all of it. Frank Miller didn't just kill Jennifer Walsh, he was married to her, and I think we're about to find out she wasn't his only victim." The investigation moved quickly after that. Federal agents descended on the Miller family like a storm, armed with search warrants and decades of experience in hunting down killers who thought they'd gotten away with murder. Frank Miller was arrested on a Tuesday morning while he was having breakfast. Sarah Miller collapsed when they told her about the bigamy, about the murder, about the storage unit full of evidence that proved her husband was a monster. David held my hand as we watched his father being led away in handcuffs. For the first time in 23 years, justice was finally being served. But even as I felt the satisfaction of seeing Frank Miller pay for his crimes, I knew the hardest part was yet to come. Because eventually, David was going to learn the truth about who I really was. Eventually, he was going to realize that his wife had been lying to him from the moment they met. Eventually, I was going to have to tell him that I'd destroyed his family, not just for justice, but for revenge. The terrible truth about love is that it doesn't always survive the revelation of deeper truths. And as I watched my husband grieve for the father he'd lost and the family that had been built on lies, I wondered if what we had between us would be strong enough to survive what was coming next. Because Frank Miller's arrest was just the beginning. The real reckoning was still ahead of us, and I wasn't sure any of us were prepared for the price we'd all have to pay for the terrible truth I'd spent 8 years uncovering. But Jennifer Walsh deserved justice, and if that meant sacrificing everything I'd grown to love about my life as Amanda Miller, then that was a price I was willing to pay. Some truths are worth any sacrifice, even if they destroy everything you hold dear in the process.